She had learned early on that in her family, silence was safer than speaking. Every time she tried to explain herself, to share her dreams or ideas, it was met with laughter, dismissal, or the kind of polite nod that made her feel even more invisible than outright rejection. Over the years, she had learned to shrink into herself, to make herself small at the dinner table, in conversations, in family photos. It was easier that way. The day she came back home, jobless and exhausted, her family didn't even pretend to care. They were gathered around the kitchen island, drinking coffee and discussing her older sister's latest promotion at the bank. The room was filled with self-congratulations and backpats, as if her sister had single-handedly saved the global economy. No one asked her how she was. No one noticed the dark circles under her eyes, or the way her shoulders drooped under the weight of the last 2 years. They barely glanced at her suitcase. Someone made a passing joke about the artist returning from another failed quest, and everyone laughed. Even her mother smiled into her cup, eyes not meeting hers. She stood in the doorway for a long second, waiting to be acknowledged. She wasn't. So she wheeled her suitcase down the hall to the guest room, her old bedroom, now converted into a home gym that no one used. Dinner was worse. Her father opened a bottle of wine to celebrate family, which usually meant celebrating the achievements of her siblings. Her brother had landed a new contract for the construction company, her sister was managing million-dollar portfolios, and she had returned from another failed startup, another round of investors lost, another dream smothered by the weight of reality. She tried to eat quietly, but every bite felt like shame. They talked over her. Around her. Occasionally about her, but never to her. Her brother joked that maybe she should marry rich since her entrepreneurial spirit wasn't paying off. Her sister quipped that some people just aren't meant to succeed. Her mother said nothing. Her father raised his glass and toasted to winners in the family, deliberately turning his body away from her as he spoke. She felt like furniture, present but inanimate. The girl they never really believed in. The one who always had her head in the clouds, the artsy one, the dreamer. She had graduated top of her class in university, but they had dismissed it as a soft major. When she'd raised capital for her first startup, they said it was a fluke. When it failed, they said we told you so. There was no in-between, no room for growth. Only a permanent seat at the kids' table, no matter how old she got. Her bedroom had become a storage closet, so she slept on a fold-out cot surrounded by old vacuum-sealed winter coats and boxes labeled Christmas 2018. She spent the nights staring at the ceiling, trying not to cry. She told herself she was just regrouping, that this was temporary, that she'd find a way to start over. But every sound of laughter from the living room chipped away at the resolve she had left. Days turned into weeks. She cooked sometimes, helped around the house, did the shopping. No one thanked her. They joked that she had plenty of time anyway. When she tried to show them a freelance project she was proud of, they barely glanced at the screen. Her brother muttered something about real jobs, and her sister rolled her eyes, saying she had meetings to prepare for. Her mother just nodded, distracted. At one point, they started talking about selling their late grandmother's cottage, one of the only places she had truly felt safe in as a child. They talked about it like it was an old sock drawer, casually mentioning market values and demolition potential. When she gently objected, her father gave her a look that froze her mid-sentence. "Let the adults handle this," he said. She didn't reply. She couldn't. Her voice had curled in on itself, too bruised to come out. So she just nodded and left the room. Every part of her screamed for air, for dignity, for the chance to say, "I matter." But she knew they wouldn't listen. Not now. Maybe not ever. They didn't know the hours she had spent building proposals, the nights she hadn't slept, the months without a paycheck. They didn't see the person behind the failure. They only saw the result, another business gone, another daughter coming home empty-handed. In their eyes, she was a burden. A soft story. A disappointment politely tolerated at holidays. And yet, they always kept her close enough to mock, to compare themselves against, to reassure each other that at least they weren't her. She thought of leaving in the middle of the night, no note, no explanation, just gone. She thought of writing a long email, pouring her heart out, naming every cut they'd made with their words. But what was the point? They'd read it, maybe. They'd laugh, probably. Nothing would change. So instead, she stayed. Quiet. Patient. Invisible. And somewhere, beneath the silence, something began to shift. Not loud, not angry, just steady, like a tremor before an earthquake. The weeks that followed blurred into each other like watercolor left out in the rain. There was no clear beginning or end to her days, only the slow erosion of time marked by errands, silence, and the subtle sting of being tolerated. The mornings began early, not by choice, but because the sun found its way through the thin curtain of the storage room where she slept. The cot creaked with every movement. Her back ached. Dust danced in the sunlight, a quiet reminder that this space wasn't meant for living. She moved through the house like a shadow, doing the dishes before anyone noticed, folding laundry that wasn't hers, offering rides to appointments no one thanked her for. Every small act felt like a plea: notice me, need me, forgive me for failing. But nothing changed. Her family accepted her presence the way one accepts background noise, there, but irrelevant. They still had dinners without inviting her. They still held meetings and discussions in the living room while she pretended not to listen from the hallway. Sometimes she went for long walks, not because she wanted exercise, but because it was the only time she could feel herself breathe. She would walk past the houses of strangers, past the rows of lives that looked better, happier, more intact than hers. She'd watch children play in front yards and think of the child she used to be, the one who dreamed in vivid color, the one who believed that hard work would always be rewarded. When she checked her email, there was nothing. The last few clients had ghosted her. The startup forums she once frequented were filled with success stories and funding announcements that felt like reminders of everything she had failed to become. Her old team had moved on. Some had joined other ventures. Some had deleted her number. Even the shared drive had been locked. She no longer had access to the work she'd poured herself into. Money became a quiet panic that pulsed in the background of her thoughts. She had a few $100s left in her savings account and a credit card she didn't dare use. Her phone bill was overdue. Her laptop was starting to fail. She applied for jobs at marketing firms, design agencies, even grocery stores. Nothing came back. Not even a rejection. She overheard her sister on the phone one evening, laughing about how some people just don't have the head for business and how not everyone is meant to play in the big leagues. It didn't take a genius to know who she was talking about. Her mother chimed in with a story about a woman from church whose son had gone into real estate and was now doing very well. They made it sound like success was a moral quality, something you either had or didn't. Something she, clearly, did not. The worst part wasn't the words, it was the ease with which they said them. As if she wasn't real. As if she couldn't feel the cold edges of every syllable. As if she weren't in the next room, biting her lip to keep from crying, staring at a blank screen, trying to rewrite a resume that already felt like a lie. Her father started leaving passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. Remember to turn off the lights, you're not paying the bill. Try to find a job this week. Please don't clutter the counter. Each one felt like a paper cut. Small, but relentless. Her presence had shifted from invisible to inconvenient. And yet, none of them offered real help. They didn't ask what she needed. They didn't ask how she was really doing. They just wanted her to be different, without any investment in how that might happen. She stopped trying to show them anything. No more presentations, no more ideas, no more hope that they'd change their minds. Her spirit was tired. Her confidence had grown brittle. When she spoke, it was only when necessary. When she laughed, it was reflex, not joy. Her world had shrunk to the size of a room without a lock, a house without warmth, and a future without clarity. She thought about her grandmother's cottage more and more, the way the trees whispered in the wind there, the way the sunlight filtered through the old lace curtains, the way everything felt simpler when it was just her and a notebook and the soft hum of peace. But now they wanted to sell it. A dead asset, her brother had called it. A waste of space. She hadn't said anything then. She'd learned what happened when she protested. The mockery wasn't worth it. In that silence, though, something small stirred. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe a flicker of defiance. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits in the chest and waits. The kind that makes you start a spreadsheet at 2 a.m. just to feel in control of something. The kind that makes you open that old envelope from the patent office. The kind that makes you reread the investor email you never answered. No one noticed. No one cared. They had written her off. They had buried her dreams in casual sentences and sarcastic laughs. But they forgot one thing: she wasn't dead yet. She still had time. And they had no idea what silence could grow into. It started with a message she almost didn't open. It had landed in her spam folder, sandwiched between cheap loan offers and promotions for online courses she never signed up for. The subject line was vague, unremarkable, just a name she didn't recognize and a regarding past project tag. She clicked it more out of boredom than curiosity, her finger hesitating a second longer than usual. Inside was a short message, polite and direct. Someone had come across an old pitch deck she'd posted 2 years ago on a now-defunct platform. They had questions. They wanted to talk. At first, she thought it was a scam. People didn't just reach out like that, especially not for abandoned projects from someone whose last known title was freelance consultant. But something about the tone felt real. Professional. Measured. She researched the sender, cross-checked names and connections, and realized he was exactly who he said he was, an investor with a quiet reputation and a history of picking underdog ideas and turning them into something formidable. She waited a day before replying. Not out of pride, but because her hands shook when she tried to type. She had forgotten what it felt like to be taken seriously. She sent a cautious reply, reattaching the file he referenced, explaining that the company was no longer in operation but that the core idea remained close to her heart. He responded within the hour. He wanted to meet. She didn't tell her family. Instead, she borrowed her sister's car under the pretense of running errands and drove to the city in a second-hand blazer she had ironed 3 times. The meeting was held in a quiet cafe that doubled as a co-working space. He was older than she expected, with kind eyes and the kind of calm presence that made her feel, for the first time in months, like she wasn't an embarrassment. He asked good questions. Not the kind that tested her, but the kind that gave her space to speak. And when she did, something came alive in her again. Her ideas poured out of her like they had been waiting for the moment to be heard. She talked through logistics, scalability, projected trends, integration strategies, terms she thought she'd buried under layers of failure and self-doubt. He listened. He took notes. And when she finished, he told her he was interested. The first seed money came quickly, a modest sum to build a working prototype and test it with a controlled group. She worked out of that same cafe for weeks, borrowing Wi-Fi and living off coffee and granola bars. She barely slept. She sketched and coded and revised and tested and failed and tested again. She brought on 2 remote collaborators, old contacts who were willing to help on a contingency basis. She couldn't pay them yet, but she promised them a piece of something real if it worked. And they believed her. She kept everything hidden from her family. They thought she was doing food delivery in the evenings, a lie she didn't bother correcting. It was easier that way. They didn't ask questions. They didn't care to know where she went. Her brother even joked once that maybe she'd finally accepted her level and joined the gig economy like normal people. She smiled and let him believe it. Her prototype worked. Not perfectly, but well enough to attract attention. Her investor arranged a pitch meeting with a secondary fund, and this time she didn't tremble. She walked into the room knowing exactly what she wanted, exactly what she was building, and exactly who she needed to become to make it real. They said yes. More funding followed. She incorporated under a new name, one that bore no family ties, no traces of the woman they had discarded. Weeks turned into months. Her team expanded. The product launched in beta and received positive press from 2 niche tech blogs. She moved into a rented studio apartment near the city center. It was small and overpriced and perfect. She paid the deposit herself. No cosigner. No favors. Just her name on a lease and a key that opened something more than a door. It opened the possibility of dignity. She bought a new laptop, registered a domain, hired a virtual assistant. Her investor connected her with legal counsel, someone who helped her protect her IP and quietly advised her on the potential of licensing. The numbers weren't huge yet, but the trajectory was promising. She found herself waking up with purpose again, not dread. Her days were long, chaotic, exhilarating. She cried sometimes, not out of frustration, but from the sheer relief of remembering who she was. She didn't post anything on social media. No selfies, no launches, no announcements. She didn't need validation. She didn't want them to know, not yet. Her success was still tender, still forming, like a sapling not ready for wind. But in her silence, she built something unshakable. Not just a business. A sense of self. A foundation she could finally stand on. Her past didn't haunt her anymore, it motivated her. Every joke they made, every dismissal, every time they rolled their eyes or changed the subject when she spoke, it was all fuel. Not for revenge, but for precision. She wasn't trying to prove them wrong. She was proving herself right. And so she worked. Quietly. Relentlessly. Purposefully. She was no longer the girl on the cot surrounded by boxes. She was no longer the punchline to their stories. She was something else now. Something they wouldn't recognize. Something they wouldn't see coming. She disappeared from their lives without ever leaving physically. It was a quiet vanishing, the kind that happens when someone stops trying to be seen. Her presence in the family home became incidental, something blurred at the edges of routine. They no longer asked where she went during the day, and she no longer offered explanations. Her absence at dinners or family events went unremarked, as though her physical withdrawal had simply confirmed their expectations. In their eyes, she was fading, drifting into the kind of obscurity reserved for people who never quite figured life out. In truth, she was building an empire brick by brick, hour by hour, in rented corners of the city where no one knew her name or the weight of her past. The studio she worked in was sparse, filled with extension cords, white boards, and takeout containers. There was no glamour in those days, just long hours, trial and error, and the relentless grind of someone who knew what rock bottom felt like and refused to go back. Her product had moved beyond the beta phase. A few strategic collaborations had opened doors she hadn't dared knock on before. Larger clients were expressing interest. The metrics were climbing slowly but steadily: engagement, retention, growth. Her name was beginning to appear in emails from venture partners, not as a risk, but as a rising mind worth watching. She never responded immediately. She took her time. She knew now the power of patience and mystery. Her investor remained in the background, steady and supportive, never intrusive. He understood the long game. He had seen it before. The underestimated founder who quietly built something solid while everyone else chased noise. He introduced her to his lawyer, a sharp strategist who didn't blink at the fact that her company was run from a one-room office with peeling paint. He looked at her numbers, her plans, her trajectory, and offered her more than legal advice. He offered protection. Together they structured ownership, assets, and contracts so that her foundation could not be shaken, even if the world tried. She rebranded everything under a new umbrella, no mention of her last name, no links to her personal history. Her old identity became a ghost. On paper, she was CEO of a growing software-as-a-service company with an international support team, early-stage funding, and high-retention clients. To her family, she was still unemployed. Sometimes she watched them from afar, on social media, in passing conversations, through whispers in their circles. Her brother had started taking credit for her old project, bragging at dinners about how he inspired her to try design. Her sister was moving into real estate now, selling upscale properties and posting selfies in staged homes. Her parents had stopped mentioning her to their friends. She had become an inconvenient question mark. None of it mattered. The deeper she went into her work, the less weight their opinions carried. They had forfeited their influence the moment they turned her pain into a family anecdote. She didn't need their validation anymore. The silence she'd once resented had become armor. It gave her room to move, to breathe, to build without interruption. At night, after her team signed off and her inbox quieted, she would walk through the city, past glowing windows and shuttered cafes, thinking not about revenge, but about sustainability. She didn't want to burn bright and vanish. She wanted to last. Every choice she made now was with that intention, to create something unshakable. Her developers were remote but loyal. Her assistant ran operations with precision. Her legal team handled negotiations with discretion. She was no longer just surviving. She was leading. But the duality was exhausting. By day she signed contracts and reviewed performance data. By night she returned home to a family that treated her like a ghost, a burden, or worse, a joke. The contrast was jarring, but necessary. It reminded her why she kept her success quiet. They hadn't earned the right to see this version of her. Not yet. The turning point came subtly. Her mother mentioned the family lawyer was retiring and they were looking for someone new to help with a property dispute. Her father grumbled about estate planning. Her brother had made some poor investments and was now suddenly concerned about liability. Her sister had overextended her credit in anticipation of commissions that never came. The cracks in their perfect facades were showing. They didn't know she had already retained a legal team powerful enough to dismantle small empires. They didn't know that the little girl they used to mock now sat on the board of a firm their friends were pitching to. They didn't know that one of her advisors had been approached by her brother's firm for funding, and had declined, citing conflict of interest. She said nothing. She observed. She took notes. She filed details away like weapons in a drawer, not out of malice, but out of preparation. She didn't want to destroy them. But if they ever came for her again, she wouldn't just defend herself, she would end the conversation completely. Her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And when the day came that they needed her, when they found themselves on the other side of power, looking in, they would realize too late that she had been playing a different game all along. Not the loud, performative climb they were used to, but a quiet, relentless ascent. She had become someone else. Someone they would not recognize until her name came up in a room they could not enter. The summons arrived on a rainy afternoon, slid unceremoniously beneath her bedroom door as though it were a pizza flyer or a discarded bill. The paper was crisp, official, wrapped in cold legal language that barely concealed the intent behind it. Her family had filed a formal claim over the inheritance of their late grandmother's cottage, the very same property they had once mocked her for caring about. They wanted to sell it, divide the profits, and finally be rid of what they called an outdated relic. What they didn't expect was that the title deed had been quietly updated years ago, transferred entirely into her name by her grandmother before passing, a detail they had overlooked in their eagerness to liquidate nostalgia. Still, they proceeded as if she were nothing more than an obstacle to be cleared. The tone of their claim was dismissive, patronizing, laced with phrases like legally incompetent to manage property assets and without the financial capacity to maintain ownership. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration. They believed she would fold. They assumed she couldn't afford to fight back. And that assumption would cost them more than they knew. She didn't flinch when she read the document. She didn't call them, didn't argue. Instead, she scanned each line with calm, clinical detachment and sent it to her legal team within the hour. Her attorney responded quickly, not with panic, but with quiet curiosity. He asked one question: do you want this to be over fast, or do you want them to remember it? She chose the latter. The court date was set. The irony was brutal. They had initiated the process, never imagining that she would not only show up but do so with a team more prepared, more powerful, and more connected than anything they had access to. On the surface, she played her role as they remembered her. She wore the same soft tones, the same modest smile. She arrived early, alone, carrying nothing but a leather portfolio and the weight of a past they believed they had control over. They came in loud. Confident. Her brother adjusted his cufflinks twice before sitting. Her sister whispered and giggled, casting glances like they were about to win a game they had rigged in their favor. Her parents didn't even look at her as they took their seats. The room buzzed with low conversation, papers shuffling, and the quiet hum of air conditioning. It felt like a waiting room before a storm. Then the door opened and her attorney entered. He was composed, elegant, with an understated authority that turned heads without trying. He walked past them without a glance and sat beside her, placing a thick, bound folder on the table. Her name, embossed in silver, caught the fluorescent light. That was the first moment her father turned to look at her. It wasn't recognition. It was confusion. A crack in the certainty he had walked in with. The proceedings began. The opposing counsel, a local lawyer the family had used for years, presented their claims with the ease of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. The language was performative, the logic weak. They argued from assumption, not fact. They had no idea what was waiting for them in the response. Her attorney stood, opened the folder, and began to speak. What followed was a dismantling, not loud, not theatrical, but deliberate. Every point of their claim was countered with documented proof. Ownership was clearly hers. Financial solvency? He provided statements, investment summaries, contracts signed under her name as the lead executive officer of a registered international entity. They couldn't process the words fast enough. Their daughter, the disappointment, the ghost, was now a legal and financial fortress. Her brother shifted uncomfortably. Her sister stopped whispering. Her mother looked down at her hands. Her father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. And then, without raising his voice, the attorney said the words that changed the atmosphere in the room. He named the company. Her company. He listed its market value, its investors, its partnerships. He spoke of her as a major shareholder in a holding firm tied to ventures they had only read about in headlines. And then he ended with a question, not to the judge, but to them. Before we proceed further, I believe it's important to clarify whether the opposing party is aware of who exactly they are attempting to discredit. Silence followed. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, like a curtain lifting on a scene no one was prepared to watch. Her family looked at her now. Really looked. Not the girl in the corner. Not the failed startup dreamer. But someone else. Someone they didn't know. Someone they had never taken the time to know. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The rest of the hearing unfolded like a formality. The judge acknowledged the evidence, recommended immediate withdrawal of the claim, and scheduled a final administrative session to close the matter. Her attorney thanked the court and collected the documents. Her family remained seated, frozen in disbelief. As she stood to leave, she paused briefly beside their table. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply met their eyes one by one, allowing them the space to absorb the gravity of what had just happened. They had come to strip something from her. Instead, they'd been stripped of every illusion they had used to protect their pride. And for the first time, she walked away not as the one who was left behind, but as the one no one could catch. The aftermath didn't come with an explosion. It arrived slowly, like morning fog seeping into a room where the windows were left open. In the days following the hearing, there were no calls, no apologies, no sudden reconciliations. What lingered was silence, not the dismissive kind they had once used to ignore her presence, but a heavy, unfamiliar quiet. It was the sound of realization settling into people who had spent years constructing a version of her that no longer existed. And now, faced with the truth, they had no language left to address her. She returned to her studio apartment that evening without celebration. There were no toasts, no speeches, no victory laps. She removed her shoes at the door, hung her coat with practiced precision, and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. The room around her was modest, utilitarian, yet it felt like the most sacred space she had ever inhabited. Everything in it had been earned, every chair, every line of code written at midnight, every legal document filed with foresight. It was a kingdom built in silence, sustained not by recognition but by resolve. She didn't feel joy exactly. What she felt was clearer than that. It was sovereignty. For the first time, she was entirely her own. No lingering expectations. No weight of proving herself. No war to fight. The people who had spent their lives misunderstanding her now stood on the outside of a reality they could never enter. She hadn't destroyed them. That was never her goal. What she had done was much quieter, and much more final. She had outgrown them. In the weeks that followed, word began to circulate, not directly from her, but through whispers, third-hand comments, fragments of truth stitched together with disbelief. A friend of her sister had recognized the logo on a press release. A former classmate had mentioned her name during a startup conference. Her brother's colleague at the bank had pulled up an article featuring one of her strategic acquisitions. No one confronted her. But the shift was undeniable. The questions started to emerge in the pauses of conversation, in the awkward hesitations during family gatherings. She attended one of those gatherings eventually, out of formality, not sentiment. It was a birthday, or maybe an anniversary. The reason was irrelevant. What mattered was the air when she entered. Not cold, not warm, but expectant. People smiled too tightly. Conversation stalled when she approached. For once, they didn't know how to address her. The usual jabs were absent. No one asked if she had found a job. No one suggested she date someone stable. They couldn't meet her eyes for long. The roles had inverted, and everyone felt it. She remained polite. She asked about their health, their work, the weather. She didn't mention her company, didn't correct them when they misrepresented her story. Power didn't need to announce itself. It lived in restraint. When her brother awkwardly referenced tech stuff, she nodded without elaboration. When her sister brought up property values, she let the topic pass without irony. Her father cleared his throat often. Her mother hovered nearby but said little. They were waiting, for permission, for absolution, for a moment she would never give them. Forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't always necessary. Sometimes the most powerful thing one could do was simply stop needing anything from the people who never offered it willingly. She had made peace not with them, but with herself. That was enough. As the evening faded, she found herself standing alone near the window, watching the shadows stretch across the street. There was a time when she would have given anything for one of them to stand beside her, to ask her how she really felt, to see her not as an extension of their own pride or shame but as a person in full. But that time had passed. She no longer needed to be understood by them. She had built a world where she could be seen without explanation. Before leaving, she quietly placed a small envelope on the kitchen table. Inside were notarized documents transferring the cottage to a preservation trust in her name, ensuring that no one in the family could ever sell or alter it. It would remain untouched, safe, a relic not of decay, but of endurance. It was her final act, not of revenge, but of reclamation. She stepped out into the night without looking back. The air was cool, the sky endless. Her steps were unhurried. She had nowhere to rush. There was nothing to chase. She had become something more than they ever allowed her to be, more than they ever imagined. And the beauty of it was that she had done it all without asking for their permission. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't even sad. What she felt was cleaner, deeper, something like peace. She had walked through humiliation, invisibility, and silence, and emerged not as a version of who they wanted, but as exactly who she had always been becoming. And somewhere, far behind her, in a house full of people who no longer knew what to say, the echo of that truth settled into the walls, quiet and undeniable.